Welcome to the CEC Report for February 21st. I'm Elisa Barwick, and with me today in the other chair is Robert Barwick. Welcome.
Thank you, Elisa.
Today we have 3 items. 3 economic lies being used to smash up Australia's economy. The market is selfish, we need the state. And Ukraine horror show will lead to world war if leaders don't wake up. Now, firstly, 3 economic lies being used to smash Australia's economy. Now, by way of introduction, we put out a media release today in which we discussed the shutdown of the aluminium smelter at Point Henry near Geelong. This is the latest victim, as Craig Isherwood, our leader, said in the media release, of globalisation and gamed financial markets. Now, what Craig called for in this release is the emergency nationalisation of the industry and of other crucial industries. But how exactly did free trade cause this, Robert, and how can we afford to nationalise these industries?
Well, when you make an industry like this exist entirely within a market, which is the holy grail, the market, and it's what you're doing is you're putting it at the mercy of forces that actually use the idea of a free market to manipulate the system, right? And in this case, this industry is the victim of the big global banks that have been manipulating the aluminium market. It's the victim of the big financial operators that have been manipulating the currency markets, because they're all manipulated. It's also the victim of the big operators that have been manipulating the Australian electricity market, because we have a deregulated electricity system, and there's a whole bunch of cowboys in Sydney who trade derivatives on electricity pricing, right? And before the electricity market was deregulated, for instance, and it was before it was privatised, the biggest customers were the aluminium smelters, and they would have these really long-term contracts and really cheap supplies of electricity. That's all gone now, and not only are they exposed to the spot price that gets manipulated, it's a very expensive spot price, right? So, and what we're going to talk about soon is just how valuable such an industry is and why we should never have let that happen in the first place.
And it is the case, isn't it, that the repeal of Glass-Steagall had more than just an impact on the banks, because actually when Glass-Steagall was repealed, it was the Graham-Leach-Bliley bill that enacted that repeal.
That's through the US Congress.
Exactly, yep. And that bill contained a provision which permitted commercial banks to engage in any activity which is quote-unquote complementary to a financial activity. And in Rolling Stone, actually, on February the 12th, Mark Taibbi, their financial commentator, had this to say. He said that the Graham-Leach-Bliley bill was one of the most transformative laws in the history of our economy, a law that would make possible a broader concentration of financial and industrial power than we've seen in more than a century.
Now what Matt Taibbi goes through in that article, Lisa, with a great headline, the vampire squid strikes again, the mega bank's most devious scam yet. And he's talking about Goldman Sachs. Now, he famously did an article quite a few years ago about carbon trading and how Goldman Sachs is the leading player in that. And he described Goldman Sachs as the vampire squid with its tentacles wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money, right? So in this case, Goldman Sachs, around the time of the GFC, bought up a whole bunch of aluminium warehouses that stockpile aluminium. And that's where the aluminium is stored for, well, companies like Coca-Cola, whoever uses aluminium, makes their orders. And the orders would take, a week to 2 weeks to fill. When Goldman Sachs took them over, all of a sudden the orders were delayed to many, many months. And there's a law that the London Metal Exchange that oversees the whole trade in aluminium set, that there's a certain percentage of the stockpile has to be shipped out every week. So there'd be a series of these warehouses in a row, and all Goldman Sachs's warehouse would do was just pick up some aluminium ingots in one and transfer them into another, and just keep shipping these things around in between the same warehouse complex to abide with that law. Meanwhile, they're charging rent for the aluminium being stored there, right? A percentage of that rent went back to the London Metal Exchange, actually, so they should be answerable for this as well. But the objective was to delay, with the delayed deliveries, actually force the retail price up, not the wholesale price, not what the producers are getting paid from Point Henry, right? But the retail price that they were the middlemen, and this was a total scam. And this is the kind of thing that has been manipulating the market, which has crushed so many aluminium producers, and that's why we can't let this one go under. Now, can you afford to nationalise it? Well, you can't afford not to, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what you should do in this particular case, there's 6 aluminium smelters in Australia. If the companies that are owning them, such as Alcoa, we shouldn't leave it up to Alcoa to decide, right? They're so valuable that if Alcoa says we're going to shut that one down, the government should step in and say, no, we're going to take that over. We're going to keep it going as a going concern, even if we have to subsidise it, because the subsidy will be justified.
Why?
All right. Well, that's why we call this 3 economic lies, right? One of the economic lies that's being used to smash up our economy is that Australia's advantage is in raw materials exports. And when young students go to university to learn economics, they're all very impressionable, right? And the way they get turned into sour old economists, they get taught economics as laws, such as the law of supply and demand, or the law of comparative advantage. And this is the one I want to talk about. The law of comparative advantage says that New Zealand's advantage on the world market is dairy and wool. Australia's is raw materials. China's is manufactured goods. Southeast Asia's is small crops, right? And what we should do is just concentrate on that one thing, export that to the world, and with the money we earn from that, buy everything else we need. Now, of course, that's the British Empire model of the world. That's the way the British ran its empire. Each colony specialised in one thing. The British would take cheap textiles from Manchester made with child labour, dump it on India. They make the Indians pay for that with opium, which they dump on China. They make the Chinese pay for that with tea, which they dump on the United States, and then make the United States pay with things like cotton for the textile mills and rum from Cuba, which they take to Africa to trade for the slaves. Right? That was the empire model. So this law was written by these imperialists. Right? What's the truth about raw materials? If you export just raw materials, you're robbing yourself. And in the case of aluminium, it's crystal clear. And what our press release goes through is that on the 23rd of January 1970, there was a cabinet submission made to the John McEwen cabinet, because they were discussing setting up the Australian Industry Development Corporation, and the purpose of that was to be a government financing body that could invest in value adding, because those guys from yesteryear knew how important it was. And that cabinet submission went through aluminium specifically, and the value difference between exporting the raw material versus exporting the finished product. And in $1970, 1 million tonnes of aluminium, of bauxite, the raw material, 1 million tonnes earned Australia $5 million. If we processed it one step into alumina, it earned us $27 million. If we processed it another step into aluminium and exported that, it earned $125 million. And if we processed it the last step into actual aluminium products and exported those, it earned, wait for it, $600 million. So the difference between the raw material and the final product is, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, right? It's ridiculous, or hundreds of percent, sorry. It's ridiculous, the difference. And so that difference represents jobs, it represents a living standard, and that's what having those smelters gives us for that particular industry. And therefore, my argument is, even if we, on paper, put government money there, we're not subsidising it, because that industry subsidises the whole economy.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't just say, oh, well, it's cheaper to import these things from overseas, because you have to look at the entire economy and the impact on the economy and the growth that's created, the jobs, etc., the value adding, the skills and those industries and technologies being developed.
Yeah, and we're Geelong, our city of Geelong, Elisa, is being turned into Australia's Detroit right now, right? Our economy it's like there's a death row execution of all of our important industries, and this is deliberate. Now, we said 3 economic lies. I think we sort of run out of time to go through them all. I want to name the other 2 because people can look. We're going to publish an article on this. The other 2 lies are free trade, and the third lie is the idea that the float of the dollar was the best thing that we've ever done, right? And so there'll be an article available on our website where people can go through those other three. But this is something that we just cannot allow to happen. And the one thing you can do in the case of the aluminium industry is to step in and nationalise it. And I should also say, that's not to downplay things like the car industry. The car, you know, in one sense, that's an even bigger tragedy because that's the whole industry is now gone. There's still some aluminium smelters in Australia. We should have taken the same kind of proactive approach to that, and we'll put out some stuff on that later as well.
And in the next segment, we're going to look at the ideology behind this tendency by government and by leaders to say, oh, we'll just let it all collapse. We won't intervene, hands off. So we'll join you back soon. Welcome back to the CEC Report. The market is selfish, we need the state. Now, regarding this debate about whether we should or should not bail out certain industries, you know, Hockey's been saying in the last week that he was dragged kicking and screaming to put certain guarantees forward for Qantas, and of course he didn't want to bail out SPC, etc. Well, let's have a little game of spot the difference. Compare, on this hand, SPC, the steel industry, Qantas, car manufacturing, and on the other hand, Abdul the kebab maker.
Yes, a friend of Joe's apparently.
Now, not that we don't like kebabs, but...
I love them. Abdul, keep it up.
But there is a difference. Now, the growth of the nation, in order to support its people, is the responsibility of government. And as we talked about in the last segment, there are things that the government can do to encourage that growth. And there are certain things that the private sector just cannot do. For example, things like the national medicines stockpile, things that might, you know, medicines that will be probably thrown away when they reach their expiry date and no profit is stood to be made out of it, but for the good of the nation.
Keep them on hand, yep.
So what we're seeing is the dismantling of the state. This is what the Pope Francis pointed to in his first exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, where he said that basically the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation is put ahead of the right of the state, which is charged with vigilance for the common good, to, you know, in order to keep the nation going. Now, Abbott and Hockey have repeatedly said that governments do not create wealth. The private sector creates wealth. Governments cannot fund all the infrastructure that we need alone. We need the private sector. Now, what I want you to talk about, Robbie, is how this attitude will lead to a resurgence of what is historically known as fascism.
Yeah, well, fascism is an economic doctrine. That's first and foremost. So there's all the police state overtones that people, you know, tend to have, but this was the economic doctrine that governed Italy under Mussolini, and Hitler had a variation of, etc. Right, and it was the idea in Mussolini's main guru's words. It's a merger of state and corporate power, but that was the nice way of putting it. The bottom line was, it was said that it was the idea that the state, the government, exists to make sure private corporations make money, right? And, you know, we've talked about how public-private partnerships for road building, Mussolini pioneered those. They'd get these private corporations to contract to build a road, and so that they could make money off it. If they didn't make money, they were always able to sell it back to the government at a profit that way, right? And so the people, though, ironically, Elisa, who tell us now, you know, like Joe Hockey, the age of entitlement is over. They want to push these schemes that give big corporations the dole, basically, give them government support at every step of the way. Last night, by the way, Christine Lagarde, the boss of the IMF, was in Australia. She was on Q&A on the ABC, and she said, in her lovely French accent, that the role of the government is to make sure that the private sector can make money, right? Because if they can make money, they will provide all the infrastructure we need, blah, blah, blah. So what do we mean by a resurgence of fascism, though? We had this in spades up until 1942. When the Great Depression hit, we had the Stanley Melbourne Bruce government, right? They were replaced temporarily by the Scullin government, who could get nothing done. They tried to get the Commonwealth Bank to act for the common good of all Australians and put public money into the economy through public works, infrastructure that could put people in jobs and improve the productivity of the country. And they were stopped by the private bankers who said, you have no right to we have the monopoly over money, the government can have no say in it, right? And what we've documented in some of our material, this is well-known historical fact in Australia, that to back those private bankers and private corporations up, they funded the formations of secret paramilitary armies that used to goose step and put out the arm, etc., copying the Nazis in Germany, such as the New Guard, the outfit that cut the ribbon on Sydney Harbour Bridge before Jack Lang could. And these clowns, and I shouldn't really call them clowns because they're deadly serious. There were hundreds of thousands of them. They were led by serving and former military guys. They were fully prepared to run coup d'etats against the Jack Lang government in New South Wales and the Scullin government if it came to it, right? And they didn't come to it because the Scullin government was divided and conquered out of office. Jack Lang was sacked. So you had these conservative governments take over that just did the bidding of the private bankers, right? And so there was no more tension. But when 1942, John Curtin and Ben Chifley, veterans of that period, came to power, Labor came to power, and they transformed our economy. They put the Commonwealth Bank in charge. They made us an industrial economy. And we had variations of that where the government knew that we had to have things like protectionism. We had to have industries, and the government made it happen for the next 40 years until Hawke and Keating started dismantling that in 1983. And what Hawke and Keating did was bring back these policies that were basically invented by the people around Mussolini, right? And we've had the resurgence of fascism ever since.
Yeah, the state was basically put down at that point. They said the government's going to step back, we're going to allow free trade, and the whole philosophy of free trade is the essence of this fascism because it's based upon the idea that people should just do whatever they want, ultimate freedom and liberalism, and that's proven by a couple of the theorists and the thinkers behind free trade, such as Bernard de Mandeville, who in The Fable of the Bees argued that man's uninhibited pursuit of his natural and evil instincts constitutes liberty, and the state therefore must not interfere with what he called private vices, but that the seething, congregation of all the people doing what they want would constitute the public good.
And the assumption there underlying that is that the state is some separate entity to the people, whereas the best way people should think about the state is the words of Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address. And for all you American libertarians out there who think it's all about liberty and freedom, Lincoln said, what did those men die for? So that government, the thing you hate, government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from the earth. Government is the hallmark of civilised society. And it's the people who make up the government.
Exactly.
The government is the people.
Yeah.
But it's the philosophy of the common good that makes it work.
But it's not just do what you want free for all. And Adam Smith, who's better known than Mandeville, had the same philosophy. He said that people shouldn't worry about the greater good or some greater cause for one's nation, leave that to God. He said that hunger, thirst, the passion which unite the two sexes, the love of pleasure and the dread of pain prompt us to apply those means for their own sakes without any consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them. So yeah, anything goes, do what you like, and the good is supposed to somehow magically, maybe with the free hand, arise.
The hidden hand.
The hidden hand arise out of that.
Whereas Lyndon LaRouche once said that Adam Smith's hidden hand of the free market is the pickpocket who steals your wallet.
Exactly. Now we'll stop there for that segment, but when we come back we're going to give you an update on Ukraine. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Ukraine horror show will lead to world war if leaders don't wake up. Now, we put out a media release yesterday, which was actually a call by the leader of a Ukrainian political party, Natalia Vitrenko. Now, that call was entitled, "Only the world community's acknowledgement of the neo-Nazi nature of the putsch can stop the violence in Ukraine." Now, currently, of course, various world leaders are supporting the quote-unquote protesters in Ukraine. If you've looked at any photographs on the internet of what's going on in Ukraine, these are not protests, that's very clear. What Natalia said in her call was that the violence, which has dramatically escalated this week, was instigated by the so-called opposition. The bloodshed on Tuesday, the 18th February, which around 20 people were killed that day, began, she said, when heavily armed columns of radicals attempted to storm the Rada, which is the parliament, and attacked both the police and a peaceful demonstration by supporters of the ruling Party of Regions. Now, she charged the opposition leaders with inciting this new outbreak of violence and the responsibility for the casualties, but she also laid the blame squarely at the feet of the United States and the European Union, which have been actively encouraging this. Now, Sergei Glaziev, who is an advisor to President Putin, has stated that, and I quote, American sources are spending $20 million a week on financing the opposition and the insurgents, including for weapons. It has been reported that the guerrillas are briefed on the grounds of the US Embassy and that they are being armed. I mean, this is no different from Syria. And yet people are putting it in a completely different basket as a peaceful revolution of the people.
It's a foreign-funded military insurgency by countries that are hostile to Russia and Ukraine, and that's the way the locals see it. That's why this is a real danger for war.
Yeah. Now, a member of parliament, who's also the chairman of Ukraine's ruling party, Oleh Tsaryov, stated this week in his blog that Ukraine has become the hostage of a global geopolitical game. He said the USA wants, according to its theory of engineered chaos, to create chaos and stress at the Russian border. But still there are Ukrainians who think Maidan is defending their interests. Naive Ukrainian. Now, Paul Craig Roberts, also, who was a leading figure in the Reagan administration, stated in Foreign Policy Journal that the likely outcome of the audacious strategic threat with which Washington is confronting Russia would be a nuclear one. Now, what I want you to explain is, why is this not just a danger of civil war or a broader regional war? Why is it in fact a risk of global thermonuclear war?
Well, Elisa, if people understand the fact that when you've got 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, there's always a danger of nuclear war. Sometimes it's going to be much more tense, right? What this is as bad and arguably worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's a sort of like a mirror image of how that crisis, why that crisis happened. Because what happened? The Americans detected that the Russians were trying to install nuclear missiles in Cuba. And look at where Cuba is on the map compared to the United States, right? Right next door. And Kennedy said to the Soviets, we will not tolerate this. This will be a cause for war, right? And 13 days later, it was averted, thank God, because the Russians backed down. The Soviets backed down back then. Well, in this particular case, even the news reports that all this erupted in late November when the Ukrainians didn't sign this agreement with the EU and went with Russia instead. In fact, the EU had given them an ultimatum. Ukraine wanted to sign an agreement with the EU and with Russia. And the EU said, no, you can only sign with us, not with Russia. And we'll give you $600 million and you get to live like the Greeks do under austerity. And the Ukrainians very smartly said, no, we're not going to do that. And they signed this agreement with Russia instead. The strategy from the West side was, no, they wanted Ukraine at all costs, because what they want to do, if they could have got this agreement, it was not just an economic agreement, it was a military component that would start drawing Ukraine into NATO, and their intention was to forward base their missile systems in Ukraine right on Russia's border, aimed at Russia. And Russia said no. That's Russia's red line. The other thing is Russia's major naval port is in Ukraine at Sevastopol. Right, and Ukraine's an ally, that's justified.
With access to the Mediterranean.
That's right, and so all Russia is doing is what America did 50 years ago, right? Exactly the same principle, and it's the West that's pushing this to the hill.
And they've stated unequivocally they will use their nuclear weapons if under threat. Now, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but thanks for tuning in, and come back again next week and look up the website for our latest New Citizen on Ukraine.